Hi class, today we're going to talk about chapter 22.1, Life in Sparta from the Story of the World. And before we get started, I just wanted to show you, look, I finally got curtains, so I'm kind of excited about that. So anyway, in this video, we're going to review chapter 22.1, talk about the polis, which is the Greek city-state, and then talk about one of those city-states, Sparta. So let's review. In your chapter or your chapter section, you learned about Greek culture. So Greece had, like the people in Greece, as you can see on this map, had the same language, they had the same clothes, gods, and they celebrated the Olympics. They had the same festivals. However, they had different leadership, they had different laws, and they had different armies and a different way of living. So each city did things very differently. One of those cities is Sparta. So Sparta was known and feared for their strength, fighting, and bravery. They were ruled by warrior kings, and schooling for boys looked really different than the schooling you guys have now. They were trained how to be a fighter, and they were not allowed to complain. Men over 20 needed to pass a test to join an army, and they were not allowed to live with wife or family, which is just so sad to me. Girls were taught to exercise and to be strong, mainly for the purpose of giving birth to strong Spartan warriors. They were thought to be weaker than men, and they were less important than men were in the society. So again, before we talk about Sparta specifically, I want to give you a general broad overview of the Greek city-states, which are known as the polis. So in order to do that, I want you to go and watch this video, What is a Polis by Catherine Moran. It's 2 minutes and a half. So go watch that and then come back. Now that you have done that, I want you to fill in your notes and answer the questions that she answers in the video. What is an acropolis? What is an agora? And what is a polis? And now I'm going to read to you a quote by Mark Cartwright, who summarizes kind of what the polis was, just to give you a little bit more detail. He says, a polis was the typical structure of community in the ancient Greek world. A polis consisted of an urban center, often fortified, and with a sacred center built on a natural acropolis or harbor. So he's saying that a polis, the city, had an urban center, and it was fortified by a wall, and then it had a sacred center on top of an acropolis, like a hill, which controlled a surrounding territory of land. The term polis has therefore been translated as city-state, as there was typically only one city, and because an individual polis was independent from other polis, that's the plural for polis, in terms of political, judicial, legal, religious, and social institutions and practices. That means that these different cities had different politics, they had different laws, they had different religious and social institutions. Each polis was in effect a state. Like a state, each polis was also involved in international affairs, both with other polis and non-Greek states in the areas of trade, political alliances, and wars. So the Greek polis developed during the Archaic period. And so this happened when there was a movement away from isolation in small villages during the Greek Dark Ages, and people start moving away and they come into more populated cities. So remember, we talked about how Greek history can be divided into, you have the Greek Dark Ages, and then you have the Archaic period and the Classical period. And in the Archaic period, which is where the polis was developed, was also when you have Homer and the alphabet developed and the Olympics and things like that. And the polis, this is the next point, polis becomes the most important unit in Classical Greece, which is the next period in Greek history. Greece was very different from other nations because each city in Greece was independently controlled. There was no unifying king over them like we've seen in Persia, in Babylon, in Assyria, in Egypt. Every city was very fiercely independent and wanted to do things their own way. They also believed that the polis was about the people, not about the buildings or even the land. The people in the polis were considered the city. So that means that an enemy could come in and sack the physical city, but if you can save you can save the city if you can save the people. So if the enemy comes and takes over the city, but you get the people into a different location and can start that city somewhere else, then you have saved the city. This is a very different way of thinking than we've seen before. It's very different from Egypt. Egypt believed that a city was a place where the king dwells, like the city was in that one location and that's where the king is, and you would not have been able to just move it like that. Loyalty to the polis was considered one of the highest values that a man could have. Just being very loyal, dedicated to whatever city you were in. And you weren't part of Greek society unless you were part of a polis, one of the city-states. And that's because not living by the rule of law, you weren't living by the rule of law if you weren't in the polis, because the laws all came from the polis. They did not come from outside of it. And that brings us to Sparta, which is the warrior city-state and one of the polis in Greece, in ancient Greece. Just a fair warning, I don't like Sparta, so sorry. Here's a map of Sparta right here. Sparta's right here, and you can see this kind of creamy yellow color. That is all Greece. So let's start with the city characteristics. Sparta was one of the most important Greek city-states. It was the largest of all the city-states, and it was a major player in Greek politics, like we'll see later when we study the Greco-Persian Wars. They were famous for their military power, and yeah, so Sparta was just very important in ancient Greece. And I do want to mention that the Spartans, you learn about their military stuff. The Spartans did not farm. They devoted their time to military and to politics. So they needed other people to produce food for them. And this is where the Helots come in. Helots were conquered peoples. They were semi-enslaved workers that were made to farm. And when I say semi-enslaved, that means they were not at the rank of a citizen. They were not as low as a slave, and they were somewhere in between. So they're kind of like serfs. And the Helots could keep some of the food that they farmed, but most of it went to feed the Spartans. The Spartans did not treat the Helots well. History.com says Spartans who were outnumbered by the Helots often treated them brutally and oppressively in an effort to prevent uprisings. Spartans would humiliate the Helots by doing such things as forcing them to get debilitatingly drunk on wine and then make fools of them in public. This practice was also intended to demonstrate to young people how an adult Spartan should never act, as self-control was a prized trait. So you see, like, how illogical that is? Like, here, don't act like this. This is not the way that a person should ever behave. Here, I'm going to force you to act that way by making you drunk. Like, just no. And then Sparta has, we're going to talk about their laws, but Spartan laws were unwritten. Spartans had oral laws. So basically, like, people just passed these laws on to each other. You just had to know them. The reason for that is it was against the rules to write down the laws. And the reason behind that is because Susan Wise Bauer says legislation only works if it is written on the character and hearts of the citizens. So these laws were about their character. These laws, they believed if they wrote them down, wouldn't do any good. Like, they would only work if you had them engraved upon your heart, like that you knew them so well, it was just a part of who you were. So they didn't write them down, which meant that Spartans policed each other on these rules. Imagine living in that kind of a society where you have been told all these things and you're just supposed to do it, and everyone's watching you to make sure that you don't do it. Also, you have to watch other people. Susan Wise Bauer says, the Spartan state was ruled by a strict and unwritten code of laws that governed every aspect of Spartan existence. And when I say every aspect, or when she says every aspect, it's not an exaggeration. And I'm going to show you why right now. By telling you or talking about like what were some of these unwritten laws that the Spartans policed each other over. So the first one is about children. Children belong to the city, not the family. I am completely opposed to this kind of thinking. So instead of the family, the father, the mother, or whoever was, you know, the person taking care of the children, instead of those, typically the mom and dad, instead of those people having authority over children, the city had more authority over the children than the father and the mother. Like, this sounds absolutely insane and bizarre and crazy. However, I do want to point out that this kind of thinking is becoming more popular right now, and there are people pushing for this type of country, which is really scary to me. Elders had the right to inspect each baby, and they got to decide whether a baby lived or died. And so if the elder was like, oh, your legs are not long enough, or your fingers are too tiny, or whatever criteria they used to judge whether a baby got to live or die, the baby got left in a wasteland in the mountains. And like, that's so terrible, and it's so horrific, and we look back on this and think, what were they thinking? But I would like to point out to you that in 2020, the leading cause of death was not heart disease, was not cancer, was not COVID. Those were the top three, by the way. I think it's heart disease, cancer, then COVID that are listed. The leading cause of death, winning by a long shot, was abortion. But nobody, you know, lists those on the cause of death. And so we can look back on this in horror and say, how dare anybody get to decide whether a baby live or die? How dare they leave him on the mountain? Well, leading cause of death are little babies murdered in their mother's womb, being torn apart from limb to limb. So let's not forget about that. Boys were assigned to boy herds at age 7. They ran in packs, and they learned how to fight and to find food, which is like, can you imagine a 7-year-old having to do this? Like, that's so sad. Husband and wives, this makes me even more angry. So Susan Wise Bauer says, any husband could choose to impregnate another woman or to hand his wife over to another man as long as the decision was made for the good of the master race. Yeah, I'm not making this up. So you could be like, oh, that woman and I would have a great baby, and that would benefit our master race. And she's married, but, you know, I'll just make an agreement with her husband and just impregnate her. And, you know, the woman did not get to decide whether she got impregnated or not. So that's pretty terrible. This next one I don't like either. Meals. Most meals were eaten in common mess halls, meaning everyone got to sit and eat together. Okay. This was supposed to prevent greed and indulgence. Susan Wise Bauer says this. Susan Wise Bauer quotes Plutarch, and Plutarch says this stopped them spending time at home, reclining at table on expensive couches. Plutarch explains, fattening themselves up in the dark like insatiable animals, and ruining themselves morally as well as physically by indulging every whim and gorging themselves. So, you know, take away a family's ability to have time together and eat dinner together, like the one time a lot of families have, and say, no, you have to all eat together to police each other to make sure you guys all don't get fat. Like, you know, don't learn to practice self-control. Just watch each other. I'm sorry, guys. Spartans kind of tick me off. Okay. Yeah. And then just we're going to keep going with that thread. Girls and boys. When girls, who were the future mother of Spartan warriors, were required to dance naked in front of crowds of young men. This gave them additional motivation to stay slim. Plutarch adds that the stakes were leveled somewhat by another law which gave girls an opportunity to taunt the young men one by one and helpfully criticize their errors. Like, I don't even know. I don't have anything to say. Like, just no. Furniture. This one's like the most mild one. The doors and roofs of houses could be shaped only by axe and saw. To use more refined tools was illegal. This was meant to prevent a longing for fine furniture and fabrics, since these would look ridiculous next to rough-hewn wood. So, you know, just don't create beautiful things and just make them look bad so that you won't want other beautiful things, because those beautiful things won't look good next to these bad things. Just, that one's kind of ridiculous. Okay, and then Spartan Education. You read about this in the Story of the World section that you read, but I want you to go watch this video, which does just a great job animating and then explaining what this looked like. So go watch this and then fill out this section that I'm having you write in your notes. So I'm going to try to go calm down. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.